There's a strange shift happening in the way that we talk about our emotions.
Sometimes you have to be a little disrespectful to show them just how respectful you've been.
Respecting your boundaries, that's not disrespectful.
Here's what happened in a toxic family.
On the surface, this sounds emotionally intelligent, but the tragic truth is that behind this polished vocabulary is something far more disturbing. These words that were designed to heal us are now being used in ways that confuse us, divide us, and sometimes even harm us tremendously.
If we're having a conversation and you start using your therapy vocabulary on me, you're canceled. I'm over it.
When did emotional intelligence become a competition? When did therapy concepts become a way to win arguments? And when did every normal conflict get labeled as abuse? How therapy speak is destroying your mental health. Before I get into any of the criticism, I do want to start with a bigger picture. Whenever someone points out the problems with therapy speak, people often react by assuming that it's an attack on therapy itself or on mental health awareness. I want to be abundantly clear, this is not the case. In fact, what society has achieved around mental health in the last few decades, in my humble opinion, is one of the most important social transformations of the modern era, and you can quote me saying that. There was a time, and not even that long ago, when talking about your mental health made you seem weak. Heck, even when I was going through high school, it seemed like a taboo. Trauma was something people were expecting to bury. Depression was seen as laziness. Anxiety was being viewed as a character flaw. Therapy was for people who were considered mentally unstable, and everyone else was expected just to get on with things and suffer silently. If you were struggling, you were told to toughen up, stop complaining, and get over it. And the landscape has changed dramatically in the late 20th century, especially with the introduction of the DSM-3 in 1980. That moment marked a turning point because mental disorders were finally standardized, categorized, and recognized in a way that doctors, courts, and institutions could document and understand. PTSD, which had existed throughout human history, became a legitimate diagnosis. Veterans who found it hard to reintegrate to society after their traumatic service were no longer dismissed as weak or broken. Survivors of trauma were no longer ignored or ridiculed. They finally had language, recognition, and support. And this is all to say, clinical labels, when used appropriately, are incredibly valuable. They act as informational shorthand that communicate seriousness. When a doctor gives someone a diagnosis, it protects that person. It communicates that they need care rather than judgment, a signal that says this person deserves support and understanding. As millennials and Gen Z grew up, something even more transformative occurred. These generations began talking about mental health even more openly. They rejected the old shame-based systems and forced society to adapt. Workplaces had to acknowledge burnout and employee well-being. Schools began offering counseling as a normal resource. Friends encouraged each other to seek therapy, and being in therapy became a sign of self-awareness rather than a moral failure or mental weakness. I don't want to overstate this, but I think it bears repeating. The destigmatization of mental health is one of the greatest achievements of our time. Real therapy, practiced by trained professionals, is not only helpful, but often life-saving. Therapy speak, when used inside of its intended setting, just like medicine, is also a valuable tool. Words like boundary, trauma, attachment, and regulation help people navigate their emotions and communicate them much more effectively. But something has happened along the way. Somewhere between the therapist's office and TikTok, between clinical journals and Instagram infographics, the terminology escaped into the general population. What started as a precise and powerful vocabulary for healing slowly transformed into a cultural trend. The more widely the language spread, the more detached it became from its intended purpose. And once that happened, something that was designed to help people began to be used in ways that often do the opposite. And this is where the real story begins. When clinical words used in therapy become therapy speak. The meme-ification of therapy. Therapy, in its true form, is a slow process. It's built on trust, nuance, care, and patience. Ask anyone who's been to therapy and they'll tell you it takes a really long time to make progress. It's not a quick fix, and it's not supposed to be. As a result, it does not translate well into platforms that reward speed, simplicity, and emotional impact. In an algorithmic world, nuance, it can't survive. What thrives are short, bold, oversimplified statements like, "Here are 5 signs you might have anxiety," or "a single behavior being labeled as evidence of a personality disorder," or a 20-second video claiming that people with avoidant attachment always behave in a specific way. These videos turn complex and nuanced psychological conditions into quick identity quizzes. Viewers watch these clips, resonate with vague statements like, "Sometimes I feel empty," and conclude that they must have a certain disorder. There's no clinical interview, no exploration of context, no differential diagnosis, and no professional oversight. It's psychology without the psychologist. This is what many researchers describe as a flattening of nuance. Ideas that were originally designed for one-on-one discussions, guided by trained professionals, are being compressed into fast, digestible content. Concepts that took decades to study are being distilled into sound bites meant to be scrolled past in seconds. The situation becomes even stranger when people begin using AI tools as makeshift therapists. Users will give prompts that instruct the model to act as an emotionally supportive counselor. The model responds with compassionate language because that is what the user asked for, but there's no human context, no clinical reasoning, and no professional responsibility. The person feels heard, but they're not actually receiving any treatment. They're just receiving simulated empathy. And don't get me wrong, AI can be a helpful reflection tool similar to journaling. But using it as a replacement for therapy blurs very, very important boundaries. It creates the illusion of support without the structure or, more importantly, accountability that real mental health care requires. And all of this is contributing to a major cultural shift. Therapy language is no longer confined to therapy. It's everywhere. It's on TikTok, in group chats, on dating profiles. It's in corporate memos, influencer captions, and even political debates. These words have been absorbed into the mainstream, but minus the very important context that gives them a usable meaning. And once therapy language became internet language, it also became a form of social currency. Using the right therapeutic buzzwords makes people sound emotionally intelligent. It signals that they're informed, and so it has become an aesthetic of intelligence and maturity. But this begs the question, how did therapy speak go from almost being shunned by society to becoming not just popular in and of itself, but also making the speaker appear more valuable? The traumatic rise of therapy speak. There are several reasons why therapy speak became so popular so quickly. The first is what philosophers call, and I adore this phrase, epistemic authority. When you use clinical language like epistemic authority, you sound like you're appealing to an objective truth. You sound like you are diagnosing something real, something scientific. You're no longer expressing an opinion, you're stating a fact. Instead of saying, "I don't like that behavior," you say, "That behavior is toxic." Instead of saying, "Oh, I'm really upset," you say, "I'm triggered." One version sounds subjective, because it is. The other sounds definitive. It gives people a sense of credibility that, well, they might not actually have. The second reason is something that I prefer to call the aesthetics of intelligence. Using therapy language makes people feel enlightened. It makes them feel like they have a deeper understanding of themselves and others. It gives the speaker a sense of moral authority, as if using therapy buzzwords proves that they are emotionally sophisticated. Even when somebody is simply expressing a personal preference, the language makes it sound like a clinical observation. It's like when people start using the French versions of words to sound more posh. You know, those words that have a certain je ne sais quoi to them. There's also what I like to call the HRification of intimacy. And I want to touch on this, by the way. It's random, but adding ification to words to create the derived version of that word is a brilliant linguistic move, if I can toot my own horn. It's something you can immediately understand without having to think twice. I'll rattle off a few. The Mr. Beastification, TikTokification, HRification. You just immediately get what I mean, even though those aren't really words, you know? Anyway, I digress. What was I? Oh, right. So, therapy speak makes personal relationships sound like workplace arguments. Instead of saying, "I feel hurt when you do this," the person says, "I no longer have the capacity to hold space for this interaction." The phrasing creates this emotional distance. It takes a messy human moment and reframes it as a bureaucratic process. It provides a sense of safety because bureaucratic language feels a lot less vulnerable, and it allows someone to deliver criticism, rejection, or discomfort with the tone of a company memo. These factors combined make therapy speak incredibly tempting to use. It feels empowering. It makes us feel intelligent. It gives the illusion of clarity and professionalism. But this is also where problems start to crop up. Because once this language spreads outside of therapy, people start applying it in situations where it does not belong. They use it to justify avoidance, to protect their ego, to control others, or to pathologize normal, everyday experiences. And that brings us to the central critique of this entire video. Therapy speak is no longer just a vocabulary. It's become something of a weapon. It's being used to win arguments, to avoid accountability, and diagnose people who have done nothing more than annoy us. How therapy speak gets weaponized online. This is the heart of the issue. Therapy speak, despite its helpful origins, has evolved into a tool that can distort reality, erode relationships, and undermine actual mental health care. And it gets weaponized in several ways. First, you have the over-pathologizing of normal human emotions. One of the biggest problems is that therapy speak encourages us to pathologize feelings that are completely normal. Researchers like Alan Horwitz and Jerome Wakefield have warned about this for decades, actually. When ordinary sadness gets labeled as depression, or normal grief is described as a disorder, we begin to lose the ability to distinguish everyday emotions from clinical conditions. We're also losing the vocabulary for normal interpersonal conflict. Instead of saying, "Well, I don't get along with this person," people instantly label that person as toxic. Instead of saying that we disagree, they say that I'm being emotionally abused. The language escalates the situation and transforms a simple, everyday conflict into a moral or a psychological diagnosis. Another consequence is the medicalization of social problems. When people feel burnt out, they often describe it as an internal disorder rather than a reaction to external pressures like overwork, financial stress, or social inequality. And by framing everything as an individual issue, we're ignoring the systems that create these stressors in the first place. When everything is trauma, we miss the real causes of suffering, and we also strip the word trauma of its seriousness. Therapy speak also fuels a phenomenon psychologists call concept creep. Over time, psychological terms begin to expand in meaning until they cover milder and milder experiences. Trauma no longer refers to life-threatening events. It becomes any situation that leaves you unpleasantly surprised. OCD no longer refers to a debilitating condition. It becomes a preference for cleanliness and organization. Every animal behavior research shows this pattern. The term canine aggression once referred to violent attacks, but over time, it has grown to include something as harmless as a small dog barking. This widening of definitions distorts our understanding of reality. If someone calls a bad boyfriend a narcissist, they are turning a specific set of behaviors into a fixed, pathological identity. If someone accuses their partner of gaslighting during a normal argument where one is just trying to defend themselves, they're framing a disagreement as intentional psychological abuse. The language encourages people to assume malice where there might just be misunderstanding or, at worst, frustration. The dilution of these terms also harms people who genuinely suffer from the conditions being discussed. When everyone claims to have trauma, OCD, or a personality disorder, the terms begin to lose their meaning. People with severe conditions are pushed aside because the language that once protected them is now used casually by everyone else. It's like someone with a mild leg pain using a parking spot designated for people with genuine mobility issues. There's also the issue of using these words as a way to avoid responsibility. Terms like boundary, bandwidth, capacity, and emotional labor are used as escape routes. Instead of being honest about not wanting to do something, people frame their decision as a mental health necessity. Instead of apologizing for hurting someone, they say their trauma made them do it. Instead of engaging in difficult conversations, they shut them down by claiming they're triggered by the topic. That language acts like a shield. If someone critiques your behavior, you can just dismiss it by saying that they're violating your boundaries or harming your mental health. It blocks dialogue and it prevents growth. It creates a one-sided dynamic where the person using therapy speak demands unlimited compassion while offering nothing in return. One of the clearest examples of this misuse was the case involving Jonah Hill, when the text that he allegedly sent his partner got leaked and sparked a massive public conversation. He claimed he was setting boundaries by telling his partner that she couldn't surf with men or post certain photos. But those aren't boundaries. A real boundary is about your reaction to certain situations, not what someone else has to do for you. For example, setting a boundary is saying, if this situation continues, I'm going to step back, and not, you have to change yourself to make me comfortable. By framing a personal preference as a mental health need, the person creates a situation where any disagreement becomes an attack on their well-being. If someone says, this is my boundary, you cannot question it without appearing harmful. This ends the negotiation. It completely ends communication. It implies that the speaker's emotional needs override the other person's autonomy. This misuse appears in smaller situations too. If you accuse someone of gaslighting during a regular argument, you're essentially declaring that your perception is the truth and that theirs is an underhanded manipulation. It gives you an unfair advantage and turns conflict resolution into a psychological battle. Another force behind this weaponization is the way social media algorithms operate. The internet rewards content that is dramatic, emotional, and absolute. Saying this behavior is narcissistic, well, it's bound to get more attention than saying that this is a minor communication issue. I mean, just narcissistic sounds like it has more punch. Influencers and therapists alike feel pressured to produce content that resonates immediately, which often means simplifying or exaggerating clinical ideas. So what we end up with is mental health advice optimized for virality, not accuracy. These viral messages shape how people understand themselves and others, even when the content is poorly grounded or even misleading. And all of these problems accumulate and lead us directly into the consequences that are affecting real mental well-being. How this harms actual mental health. All of this misuse of therapy language eventually loops back around and begins harming the very thing it was meant to protect. When clinical terms become social tools, aesthetic choices, weapons and arguments, or currency for online validation, they create real damage. And that damage shows up in the way people relate to others, in the way they understand themselves, and in the way they navigate problems that used to be considered a part of ordinary life. One of the clearest consequences is something that psychologist Dr. Anna has been described as building a moat of water around a fortress. People begin using boundaries, capacity, and emotional labor as rigid walls rather than flexible guides. They create a system where any relationship that requires effort becomes a threat to their well-being. Instead of negotiating, apologizing, or even listening, they default to cutting everything off. The moat grows deeper and wider until it becomes almost impossible for anyone to get close to them. Well, the irony is that this intense focus on self-protection usually leaves people more isolated than ever. We're seeing this reflected in what many experts are now calling the loneliness epidemic. People are living more individually than at any point in human history, even though we have the technology to be closer than ever before. We're spending more time on our phones, less time in our communities, and less time doing the difficult but meaningful work of maintaining our friendships. You hear words like, "it takes a village," but no one realizes that village isn't just about free labor. You need to be able to show up for those people emotionally and otherwise. The cultural message tells people to remove anyone who drains their energy, and as a result, individuals find themselves with fewer and fewer sources of support. This hyper-individualistic approach creates a world where people say things like, "I would rather stay in bed than deal with the messiness of connection." The internet even glamorizes this behavior, turning social withdrawal into a quirky personality trait. But loneliness? It's not cute. It's one of the most dangerous public health issues that we are currently facing. It increases rates of depression, anxiety, physical illness, and even leads to premature death. And yet, the rhetoric of therapy speak often encourages people to withdraw from conflict instead of developing resilience within their relationships. And this actually segues me nicely into my next point, which is the erosion of resilience itself. When we treat every negative feeling as a crisis, we become less capable of handling the normal challenges of life. We start to believe that everything bad is a sign of something wrong, rather than a natural part of the human experience. Therapy is supposed to make us stronger, but therapy speak often teaches people that they are inherently fragile. When people are constantly told to prioritize comfort over growth, they lose the ability to cope with anything that feels even remotely difficult. Another consequence relates to credibility. When people misuse clinical terms, they weaken the power of those terms for the people who truly need them. It becomes the psychological version of the boy who cried wolf. If everyone describes minor inconveniences as traumatic, well, the word trauma kind of loses its meaning. If everyone claims to be gaslit every time someone disagrees with them, then real gaslighting becomes harder to identify and harder to take seriously. When the severity of a term is diluted, the individuals who genuinely experience serious forms of psychological harm are left without the vocabulary or the social support that they need. This dilution also affects how mental health professionals do their jobs. Therapists and psychologists already struggle with misunderstandings around what terms actually mean. When a client comes in saying that they have diagnosed themselves based on TikTok videos or on labels used casually in friend groups, therapists have to spend additional time teaching them to unlearn these misconceptions. It becomes harder to treat someone when the language being used no longer aligns with a clinical reality. And the misuse of therapy speak is also changing how people see each other. Instead of interpreting behavior through the lens of misunderstanding or context or personality, people just default to medicalized judgment. If a friend is being short-tempered with you, you assume narcissism. If a friend forgets something that you said, you assume manipulation. Everyday relationship mistakes are becoming pathologized. Instead of working through a conflict, people are jumping directly to labeling each other with disorders, and that's wrong. This not only leads to broken relationships, but also teaches people to see others through a lens of suspicion and threat. There's also a broader societal effect. When everything becomes internalized as a personal mental health issue, people stop examining external factors like economic pressure, workplace exploitation, community breakdown, or cultural expectations. If you're burnt out, you're told to meditate or cut back on emotional labor rather than questioning the systems that created the burnout in you in the first place. The social consequences become individual problems, which allows the systems causing these stressors to go ultimately unchallenged. On a personal level, therapy speak can trap people in a fixed identity. If you constantly label yourself with clinical terms, you begin to build a sense of self around being damaged, fragile, or limited. Instead of seeing yourself as capable of growth, you start to believe that you're defined by your wounds. This can lead to a form of self-handicapping where people avoid opportunities because they fear triggering themselves, or avoid relationships because they believe that they don't have the capacity. In the long run, this reinforces the very issues they are trying to manage. Another subtle consequence is the false sense of superiority that therapy speak can create. Because the language sounds clinical, people begin to feel morally or intellectually above others who do not know the terminology. It creates a hierarchy where the person using therapy speak seems enlightened, while the person using normal language seems uneducated or emotionally immature. This dynamic breaks down communication further because it replaces empathy with condescension. Finally, therapy speak can erode genuine emotional expression. People stop saying things like, "I'm hurt," "I'm mad," or "I'm confused." Instead, they use scripted phrases like, "I feel unsafe," or "I do not have the emotional capacity." And these phrases, sure, they sound refined, but they often hide the actual, real emotions underneath. The person speaking feels protected, but the person listening is feeling shut out. In trying to appear composed, people sacrifice authenticity, and as a result, emotional connection becomes harder, not easier. These consequences show how therapy speak, when misapplied, does not only fail to help, it can actively undermine mental health. It creates distance instead of closeness, fragility instead of resilience, and misunderstanding instead of clarity. What therapy actually is for. Therapy speak has drifted far from its original purpose, but the solution is not to abandon therapy language altogether. Let's make that clear right here. The real solution is to understand what therapy is actually designed to do. Because when therapy is practiced correctly, it is a tool that helps people open up. It teaches you how to let people in safely, not completely shut everyone out. Good therapy helps you remove the internal debris that gets in the way of genuine connection. It helps you grow your capacity, not shrink it. It expands your ability to handle discomfort and maintain relationships even during difficult times. One of the biggest failures of therapy speak is that it encourages people to project their psychological insights onto others. It is almost always outward facing. People say things like, "You're toxic," "You're a narcissist," "You're gaslighting me." Well, real therapy is meant to flip that attention inward. It asks you to question your own interpretations. It asks you to investigate your role in conflict. It encourages self-reflection by asking questions like, am I being reasonable? Am I reacting to the situation or to something from my past? And is my boundary genuinely protective, or is it another form of control? A healthy therapeutic mindset requires humility. It means acknowledging that your perspective is not the only perspective. It means understanding that other people have emotional needs too. Therapy is not meant to give you the moral high ground. I don't believe it ever was meant to do that. It is meant to help you understand yourself well enough that you can navigate relationships with empathy and accountability. Another key principle is reciprocity. Therapy does not teach you to cut everyone off the moment they disappoint you. It teaches you how to communicate through those disappointments. It teaches you to show up for others just as you expect them to show up for you. Many people misunderstand self-care as a solitary pursuit, but true self-care includes the health of your relationships. You owe your friends kindness. You owe your partner patience. You owe your community presence. Healthy relationships are not built on rigid individualism. They're built on mutual support. Real therapy is also about cultivating resilience. Feeling anxious does not mean that you must avoid the situation forever. Feeling angry does not mean something has violated a boundary. Feeling sad does not mean that you are broken. Emotions are signals, not diagnosis. Therapy helps you understand those signals without creating catastrophic interpretations around them. When therapy is practiced as intended, it does not reduce the world to a psychological battlefield. It teaches you how to interpret behavior in context. It helps you understand the difference between someone who is actively harmful and someone who is flawed but trying their best. It gives you the ability to separate normal relational friction from genuine abuse. In its real form, therapy is a bridge, never a wall. How to use therapy language responsibly. If there's one message, one key takeaway at the end of all of this, it is that language matters. The words we use shape how we see the world and how we relate to the people in it. Therapy speak can be incredibly helpful in the right context, but outside of those contexts, it can also distort reality and damage relationships. The goal isn't to throw out therapeutic language, but to return it to its proper place. And the first step, drop the script. When you're talking to a friend or a partner, use authentic language instead of the polished, professionalized vocabulary of therapy speak. It is much better to say that you are hurt than to say that you feel unsafe. It is much better to say that I do not like what you said than to say that that is toxic. When you use the more clinical phrasing, you often obscure your real emotions from the person you're talking to. Sure, you sound more sophisticated, but you don't sound more honest. People cannot connect with a script. They connect with you. The next step is to remember that context matters. Clinical language is appropriate in clinical settings or in situations that are genuinely severe. If you are experiencing abuse, coercion, or trauma, these terms are absolutely legitimate. But in everyday friction, the more clinical the language becomes, the more dramatic and unhelpful the interaction tends to be. Not every disagreement is a disorder, not every argument is a manipulation, and not every mistake is a violation. While we're here, another important guideline is to stop diagnosing the people in your life. If someone hurts you, you do not need to call them a narcissist. If someone forgets something, you do not need to call them a gaslighter. Instead of attacking their character like that, focus on the behavior. Say to them, I didn't like when you did this, instead of, you are this kind of person. When you label someone with a clinical identity, you deny them the chance to grow. You trap them then inside a category that they may not actually deserve to be in. Using therapy language responsibly also means allowing space for the possibility that, hey, you could be wrong. Interpersonal conflicts are complicated. No one said they were easy. Memory? It's unreliable. Emotions? Messy. If you assume that your interpretation is always the correct one, you turn therapy speak into a shield that protects your ego but destroys your relationships. Responsible use of therapeutic concepts includes curiosity, flexibility, and humility. My final thought is this. Be mindful of the world that you create with your words. If everything is a pathology, you end up living in a world that feels sick. If every discomfort is trauma, you will start seeing danger everywhere. But if you use language to understand, to clarify, and to connect, then you can build a world where relationships can survive conflict and people can grow. It deepens intimacy and expands your ability to live a full, connected life.